It involves the schedule itself, the Gantt chart, I'll share that with you shortly, and a critical path method, especially for a complex project to determine the important tasks that need to be done in the longest duration of time. So if you look at the Gantt chart on the left side, again, it talks about, in this case, the work breakdown structure, activity A, B, C, etc., in terms of the different attributes or tasks, and then when they're scheduled, their overlap, when they begin, when they end. And then when you look at the critical path, it's simply put, it's the longest path with the longest duration. So noted in the top, red versus the bottom, black, okay, from start to end, the critical path is noted in red. 3 plus 1 plus 3 plus 2, total of 9 is the critical path for that particular project. Two techniques I also want to share with you in terms of compressing. You need to get it done. You're trying to escalate, if you will, because time is now precious. You're approaching the end, for example, of a key deliverable or project end date. Fast tracking and crashing. Actual results will differ, but to meet a project deadline, you're going to have to take some type of corrective action. So consider either fast tracking or crashing, and I'll share examples of that in a moment. And you want to apply either of these to get, quote, back on track. And the objective is to somehow, some way, compress the schedule, hopefully without changing the scope. So here's an example of fast tracking. It's the critical path activities that are potentially performed in parallel. But you do the parallelization, let's call it, only if the activity doesn't have dependencies that need to be completed first before you start that task. So here's a simple example. If you look, there's 3 activities, activity 1, 2, and 3. On the left, they're done in series. Do 1, complete, start 2, complete, start 3, complete. But if you want to fast track, if 2 and 3 don't have, if you will, dependencies, when you complete activity 1, do 2 and 3 together so that you've compressed to get to the end date sooner. Here's an example of crashing. Crashing, simply put, team, is a trade-off between cost and schedule, where you're going to utilize extra resources. And again, hopefully, the scope stays the same. So if extra resources were not in the initial plan, there may be additional costs, especially if you didn't have contingency or buffer in your overall budget. Crashing. So steps to follow, team, if you're falling behind. Reevaluate your risk. Understand potentially the critical path, especially if it's crunch time. If you have extra resources in budget, consider crashing, for example. Maybe, unfortunately, you may have to lower the scope if necessary, or lower the quality if necessary. Things to consider if you're falling behind from a time management perspective. So team, let's do the following. It's shortly after the top of any additional costs, because that's the other key thing also. The scope stayed the same. No dependencies, obviously. So I hope that worked out. Again, if somebody comes up with another one, feel free to post it and we'll circle back to it later, okay? So thank you. And let's now move on to project cost. Again, I love, by the way, CP, thank you. I just noticed you posted something. While assessing risks, I love that because I always start with risk in mind. Reassign tasks to better align with the timing. Now that's interesting. So I see three things in your comment. One, the risk. Two, ownership. And three, timing. I think that's excellent, CP. And I truly hope many of those deliverables, I'm assuming it was a previous project, happened on time as expected. So thank you for that. And then IO, you have one where you say the project schedule and milestone document. Absolutely, because the schedule requires time. Within time, certain deliverables, certain key milestones to maybe complete one phase and then start the next phase, as an example. So team, thank you. Keep them coming. All right. So now let's transition into project cost. And I love this cartoon where maybe a sponsor comes to you and he says, or to me, and he says, hey, Sam, does high rise refer to a building or the budget? I thought that was cute. I wanted to share with you. All right. What is project cost management? It's simply put, it's the process to estimate, to budget, to control throughout the life cycle. And like scheduling and quality, cost is a key element of the project management 10 knowledge areas. And it creates that baseline for financing and realigns it accordingly. Every activity in your project plan, in your task, has with it an associated cost. So practical considerations, I'll share with you shortly. Perform what's called the continuous 4-step process: planning, estimating, budgeting, and controlling. And revisit periodically the budget if changes occur. Why is cost important? Well, it divides everything in its associated expense, particular line items, where obviously critical decision points need to take place. Do we want to spend to do this? Can we get by with that? Okay, so practical considerations have clear expectations. Very, very important in that relationship that we talked earlier with your stakeholders. Control scope creep. As we know, when we have distractors, we could quickly, without realizing, get off track. Manage your margins, your return on investment, ROI. And generate, say, a benchmark data for future projects to help better track your costs or trending, or utilize previous historical trending in costs. Resource planning. Again, it's the process to identify what is needed to complete it, the people, the equipment. Okay? You do this before the work actually gets started, but it enables an accurate and complete inventory of all of the resources, including people, including equipment, etc., etc. As I said a little while ago, use maybe historical data, gain feedback, judgment. Remember I said earlier, as a tool and technique, for example. And where appropriate, you may not have the skill. Maybe your client doesn't have the skill. Go to a third party, some type of contract person to do it. When you look at cost estimating, this typically is the most challenging because that key stakeholder, that key sponsor, they want it as accurate as possible. So I've identified a number of areas associated with quantifying the risks, the assumptions, some of the things we touched upon earlier. But the greater the deviation between estimation and actual means your project is less likely to succeed. You're now over budget and things are all over the place kind of thing, and possibly nothing's getting done. Consider a top-down or a bottom-up approach. Past cost versus not having, say, a lot of experience, as an example, to do your cost estimation. When you look at cost budgeting, it could be part of the process of estimation, or it might be separate. You want to include those contingencies, things that are unexpected, maybe some things that are somewhat difficult to measure. But when it's all said and done, team, from a practical consideration, organizations often rely on the expected future cash flow for their funding. And during initial phases, the project manager may have a limited financial pool, but yet you're asked to set that target accordingly. A simple example that all of us could relate to is, you're building a home, but you're only able to, from a cost standpoint, maybe just do the foundation and the initial floor, if it's, say, a 2-story type of house. And you'll later complete when you have more money for your home. Simple example. When you look at controlling costs, measuring variances within certain ranges, certain limits, and this too is done throughout the project life cycle. How will it be performed? How will it be measured? And that earned value I touched upon a little while ago is, for the most part, a popular approach to measuring cost performance. So here's a typical example I want to share with you, team. This example says you, the project manager, you measure task X, that's 25% complete, to determine if the project is on track to meet the task budget. You, the PM, you calculated the planned value, and you assume the budget, let's say, is $4,000, expected to be 50% completed, say, by the end of this week. So simply put, when you look at the planned value, PV, that equals the 4,000, 50% times 5 equals 2,000. But the earned value, okay, that 25% you measure that is completed, the earned value is only 1,000. So now you have to determine the actual cost of the work. So let's say, for example, it's $800. The variable, say, for equipment, material, whatever. So the schedule variance is simply the difference, but in this case, minus 1,000. But yet the cost variance is $200, EV minus AC, actual. A negative variance says you're falling behind. Positive says you're under budget. Bottom line here, team, cost control provides transparency for decision makers to potentially respond, especially if something comes up at a spur of a moment. So tips for managing costs: plan, plan, plan. We're here, at least in the United States, under this thing called higher inflation. Maybe account for a natural disaster, a potential event, i.e. a pandemic. Track in real time. Respond promptly. If you wait, it may cost even more. So practical consideration here, team. To best manage your costs, know your project as a project manager the best you can. And start every project through a project charter like I shared with you earlier. It's a good upfront first step to at least make sure the vision of this project and the people associated with your project are in sync with you. For your future reference, some of the terms I just shared a couple of slides ago, excuse me, I have here in terms of earned value analysis. All right, the definition, how it's used, a potential equation if appropriate, and how to interpret the result. This is a great at a glance I want to share with you when you look at budgeting, when you look at costs, and some of the important things that your customer is very, that's very important to them from a budgetary standpoint. So I have several slides here that talk about that. So when you look at cost and the plan to manage cost, as I said earlier, this is the common technique for all of the different processes. The charter, as I touched upon, is an example of an input. The tools and techniques, data analysis, expert judgment, things like that. And then the resulting output is the cost management plan. A procedure maybe for how you're going to record your costs, a tool, a method. When you look at estimate costs, this is a very similar structure. Cost estimates, the project document updates, again, the plan or updates or estimates, things to that nature. Determine the budget. Here's an example. Maybe it's that baseline I talked about a few slides ago. All right. And updates, say, to your associated cost related. I think it was CP talked about risk. All right. Talked about reassigning some of those tasks to people. That has a cost associated, as CP well knows. So this is a nice at a glance to help determine the budget. So this is the third team exercise that and DC, if you join me in my class, I think it was last Monday, where a project is so unique, where you could have one project where the effort is, say, this much. You could have another project where the effort is this much. And that effort means time. That time means cost, whether it be utilizing equipment, people's times, material, things of that nature. So I like how you framed that. I really do. And I truly hope you were able to get at least, when you say perspective of establishing the budget needed. I truly hope it worked out for you, DC. I notice, DR, thank you for posting. You look at the team's run rate, the average velocity in a sprint. I love it, to determine costs. We also engage in T-shirt sizing for high-level project estimates. I like that. Very, very good. And I truly believe, just from what you're saying there, DR, it's been working out well in terms of your project estimation. And then we have CP, currently managing a jewelry company. I love it. Where I service a large number of clients, continually factoring in needed supplies to accommodate large requests. The first thing that hit me there, CP, is, for lack of a better term, supply chain, where you need supplies. I hope it hasn't impacted a day in the life of you managing this company. You go on to say, constantly adjusting suppliers, doing comparison to see where the best savings is to come, and to control the costs. Very, very good. And we're going to get into that shortly, CP, in the next topic, actually, procurement. This ultimately enables a large quantity just by monitoring where the resources can be changed. CP, that's an excellent, excellent example. And thank you all for sharing your experiences like that. All right. If there's no further comments or questions, let's now go to procurement. And again, I love this cartoon for procurement. You know, how many of you have been in this situation? You're the project manager, somebody calls and you say, quote, so let me make sure I understand. So you need us to slow time, break the law, and perform 3 miracles. And you want this done by next Tuesday. You need to dial extension 101 and ask for the Wizard of Oz. I thought that was a cute cartoon that you'd appreciate and enjoy. All right. What is project procurement management? It's simply put to purchase, rent, or contract with, say, an external resource. Those external resources, you want to foster a relationship to get the best quality. And just like CP says, hopefully to get the best value based on the quantity you need. And it revolves around time, cost, etc. And it includes sourcing, the requisitioning, inspecting, expediting. I needed it yesterday. What's truly required is what you need. So the question comes down the pro and con of services, say, performed. Can it be done in-house? Do we contract it out? But you want to have confidence either way so that it financially is sound and it fits what you're trying to accomplish in your project. So when you look at inputs to the procurement management process, here they are. And I'll show this in a different framework shortly. All right, there's about 10 different inputs that feed this, which is very, very important in one fashion or another. The schedule, the baseline, all right, the WBS, etc., etc. So when you look at a summary of the procurement management, it's broken into, in essence, 4 categories. The plan, the procurement itself to conduct it, the controlling of it, and then eventually the closeout of what was procured. So let's talk about each of them in more detail. Step number 1, the actual plan. You need to identify what is needed. A statement of work may be needed, especially if you go outside and formulate a contract. A request for proposal, RFP, would then potentially be issued. So you, maybe and/or with your stakeholders, will then determine which vendor outside of your both mutual organizations is best matched to what we're trying to do in this project. Okay, and then the other thing, this includes the requirements, the risk register, the resources, the schedule, and hopefully cost estimates. But yet, this planned procurement management is a technique to guide, to make or buy, internal, external, supplier. The tools and techniques in this: seek expert judgment. Maybe do some market research in the industry or in similar sized companies to help guide this decision. The second step is to actually then conduct it. You want to study the vendors. Who do you want to send the bid out to eventually be able to select the best one for you? Maybe have some type of what's called conference bidding, where you use the estimate to evaluate proposals. And I think many of you would agree that have been involved in this process. You know, if you get 4 or 5 back, you got a high one, you got a low one, a couple in between. Where do you want to position selection? Is it always the lowest bidder? Depends. But when you find and select one, you then sign. You want to make sure the project management plan is updated accordingly, things like that. So you want to manage the contractors. You want to understand responsibilities. Remember the RACI diagram. Okay? Contractors may have, just like stakeholders, a positive or a negative impact. Okay? But you got to keep them close also. You got to effectively communicate with them. And you got to monitor and control, be that eye in the sky to make sure they're doing their part. Maybe consider some type of inspection or audit periodically. Have some type of payment system. Maybe some type of penalty also. And then when you look at the closeout of procurement, was the work completed as initially agreed upon? Insurance and bonding is usually required to ensure there's nothing outstanding. And an audit may help in terms of some type of negotiation to manage, if you will, the overall contractual arrangement that you have. Closed procurement. And that's typically done during, say, a closeout phase, the last phase of your project life cycle. Now, what is your role as a project manager as it relates to procurement? Typically, not always, you do not administer the contract, but it's important you're a part of the process. You're part of the loop, okay? You have authority to make some agreements on behalf of the client, say that you're representing and or your company. But you need to understand the knowledge areas to really be effective and to understand the ins and outs of what is going to be needed to be done. The requirements. All right. The communication. how it's going to be the selection criteria. And this is usually done by, say, a purchasing type of department. You're going to have to work with a point of contact at that vendor, maybe an account manager, maybe a peer like yourself that's a project manager. And then, obviously, the closeout. Again, that's usually through a purchasing type of department. Your role, though, is part of that. What is a contract? Simply put, it's an agreement. But an agreement is not necessarily a contract. For example, the project charter is an agreement that brings everybody together and agrees on the elements of the charter. But it's not a contract. Okay, just remember that. It outlines the intent, if you will. Agreements are less formal. Contracts clearly are formal, more legal in nature. And there's a number of different types of contracts, but typically they're in one of three categories: fixed price, cost reimbursable, and time and material. You must understand these various types of contracts, obviously understand the differences, but project managers must also select what is best for you, the client you're serving, so that that selection achieves a win-win. If you look at fixed price, okay, the contractor agrees to supply the product or service, simply put, at a fixed price, regardless of pieces and parts and things to that nature. But if the cost becomes more, the contractor has to bear it. Buyers here have the least risk. But the key theme is scope well defined? Buyers typically prefer this type of contractual arrangement. All right? But a common mistake when a buyer asks for fixed pricing, but the statement of work is incomplete, that's when funny things happen. Risk, additional costs. We may have to cut things out, reduce quality, things of that nature. When you look at cost reimbursable, all right, this is when scope, in essence, you're not sure. And it's difficult to estimate costs. This is typically implemented where the statement of work is difficult to define. It's a moving target, so to speak. This is where a pre-negotiation fee is fixed when you start the contract. Okay? You may not know from a buyer's perspective until the seller demonstrates something. A lot of unknowns, uncertainty in this, but it can be used where appropriately very well. And then the last of the three I wanted to share with you is time and material. This is when the level of effort is uncertain, where it's maybe pay per hour, pay per unit quantity, widgets, things of that nature. And it resembles the cost reimbursable, all right, but does not factor in, say, productivity of those involved. The seller's profit is included in the hourly rate for time and material, basically throughout their time duration. And this is better suited, team, for smaller projects, shorter durations, things to that nature. I don't want to say quick and easy, but it has a perfect fit where appropriate in terms of the type of project you're trying to accomplish. So when you look at, again, one of the 10 knowledge areas, procurement, here's that template: plan, procurement, management. The output is the plan of the procurement. Similar tools and techniques and similar inputs. Conduct procurement. All right. This is where you have the agreements, possible change requests, things to that nature. You select who's going to do it, for example. And then the control, okay? The control in terms of performance of the procurement, all right? Any updates where needed, things to that nature. Okay, so team, this is our fourth and final team exercise for the group chat window. This, I really appreciate your thoughts, again, so we can learn from each other. Think of a contract that you were involved in or you were that you used, say, either as a project manager or as a key team member on a project, personally or professionally. Again, maybe remodeling your home. All right? And then include in the group chat, in just a few words, what that and how that worked. So let me show you what I mean. So here's an example. Maybe it was a fixed price where the scope was more well-defined and the supplier knew exactly, they've been there, they've done it, they had the experience. And the result of this type of contract for that type of project, there was a great working relationship. You completed the project as planned, on time, and within budget. So team, I'd appreciate it. Derek